evening and welcome to World Review 2011. I'm Tony Sabine.
And I'm Sonia Artero. 2011 establishes itself as a momentous one early on and will always be remembered for the March 11th earthquake and tsunami in Japan.
The tsunami smashes into Japan's northeast coast, killing as many as 28,000 people. Comes after a magnitude 9.0 earthquake off the country's east coast. It's the strongest quake to hit Japan since records began nearly 140 years ago.
When the cost is added up, the price tag is $300 billion US, 4 times more than Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, making it the costliest natural disaster in history. But making matters worse is the threat of a nuclear meltdown. Prefectures are the hardest hit by the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. Miyagi Prefecture takes the brunt of the tremor and subsequent tidal waves. Water up to 10 meters high in the city of Sendai sweeps away numerous cars, houses, and just about everything in its path across a large swath of coastal farmland. The massive earthquake is also felt in the Japanese capital. Many train services are suspended and more than 4 million homes are without power. At the time, Japanese officials say a number of nuclear power plants are shut down close to the epicenter of the quake. They reassure the public that there is no leakage of radioactive materials. But just the next day, authorities declare an emergency after an explosion tears through a nuclear power plant in Fukushima. Authorities evacuate thousands of people living around the plant as radiation leaks out of the complex. People living in the prefecture are told to close doors, shut windows, and cover their mouths with masks and wet towels. Further north in Miyagi Prefecture again, running water is scarce. Food is in short supply. Power is disrupted, while getting around is difficult because of road damage. Long lines form outside of convenience stores with people desperate for clean water and food. Rescue efforts are hampered by the extensive damage to infrastructure, while parts of Miyagi are still underwater. Meanwhile, Japan warns a hydrogen explosion could occur at Unit Number 3 of the Fukushima nuclear complex. The announcement comes a day after an explosion blows the roof and walls off the building housing Reactor Number 1 at the same facility. The blast destroys the building housing the reactor, but not the reactor itself, which is encased in stainless steel 15 centimeters thick. The explosion at the nuclear plant 274 kilometers northeast of Tokyo appears to be a consequence of steps taken to prevent a meltdown after the earthquake and subsequent tsunami knocked out power, crippling the system used to cool fuel rods there. Area residents test positive for radiation exposure, and more than 170,000 people within a 20-kilometer radius are evacuated as a precaution. In Sendai, many families are still without power supply. Some 310,000 people live in emergency shelters or with relatives. Another 24,000 people are said to be stranded with nowhere to go. But Japan faces a bigger humanitarian, nuclear, and economic crisis. 3 days after a devastating earthquake and tsunami, a second hydrogen explosion rocks the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The blast at the plant's Unit 3 wounds 11 workers and sends a massive column of smoke into the air. But the power station's operator said radiation levels are still within legal limits. Officials confirm a third reactor at the facility is also in serious trouble. Cooling functions and water levels have fallen at the plant's Unit 2 reactor, which could lead to overheating and another explosion. The explosion at the Fukushima plant's Unit 3 triggers an order for hundreds of people still within the 20-kilometer radius exclusion zone to stay indoors. Even the U.S. Marines' search and rescue operations are disrupted when the American 7th Fleet discovers they are docked in radioactive contamination. The USS Ronald Reagan moves its aircraft and support ships away from the nuclear power plant in Fukushima. March 15th, and China announces a voluntary evacuation of its citizens as radiation levels at the Fukushima nuclear power plant reaches harmful levels following a new explosion. In a desperate effort to cool the overheating reactors and stop a catastrophic meltdown, helicopters pour huge buckets of water. Japan also raises the alert level, placing the crisis only 2 levels below the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. And panic outside Japan. Internet rumors that radioactivity may be carried by winds and that eating iodized salt could offer protection spark panic buying. At the same time, consumers in and out of Japan shun food produced in or near Fukushima. On March 19th, it's reported that spinach and milk taken from farms near the Fukushima plant exceed government-set safety limits for radiation. The Japanese government halts all shipments of spinach from 4 prefectures surrounding the damaged nuclear plant. It also bans milk shipments from the site's home province of Fukushima. Making matters worse, Japan's health ministry reports 11 types of vegetables from 37 locations in 5 different regions are unsafe to eat. Singapore and Australia joined the United States and Hong Kong in restricting food and milk imports from Japan's radiation zone. Meanwhile, seawater is used so fuel rods will not overheat, but that creates other problems. First, used seawater is eventually dumped back into the ocean, raising fears and protests among Japan's neighbors that fish stocks could become contaminated by the radiation. Tokyo's tap water is also found to be tainted after radiation contamination penetrates a water purification plant. Bottled water is distributed to nervous mothers as panic buying begins. In addition to Tokyo's contaminated water, 3 other water treatment plants in Saitama, Ibaraki, and Chiba test positive for unsafe levels of radioactive contamination. What's more, a number of other prefectures in Japan determined their tap water is also tainted. To put it in perspective, the 13 areas with contaminated water make up 1/3 of all prefectures and municipalities in Japan. The salt from the seawater also destroys the nuclear plant's operating system, eventually rendering it useless and unsalvageable. March 25th, and Japan's nuclear nightmare gets worse. Officials now suspect the reactor core at Unit 3 may be breached, raising the possibility of more severe contamination to the environment. The breach could allow uncontrolled quantities of radioactive contaminants to escape into the surrounding ground and air. The next day in Tokyo, a city of 13 million people, ambient radiation levels are recorded 6 times the normal level. Later, radiation 10 million times the usual level is detected in the water of one of the reactor units at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. And on March 29th, Japan announces it is at a state of maximum alert after the highly toxic chemical plutonium is found in the soil near the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant. Plutonium can stay radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years, and once it gets into the body, it can damage the DNA of a cell, potentially causing cancer in those who absorb it. That, as seawater near the plant's number 1 reactor contains levels of the radioactive iodine which are more than 3,300 times above the legal limit. Contaminated seawater is even found as far as 16 kilometers south of the plant. Fish caught in nearby Ibaraki Prefecture contain levels of radioactive iodine above the new legal limit. April 12th, and an announcement that people in Japan and the world have been dreading to hear. Because of the amount of radiation released into the air and sea, Japan raises the severity rating of the nuclear crisis at the crippled Fukushima power plant to 7. That's the highest level possible, putting it on par with the world's worst nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. Japan continues to deal with the after effects of the nuclear disaster throughout the year. First, there are electricity shortages, putting more of a strain on Japan's economy. Pressure also grows on Prime Minister Naoto Kan to resign, leading to more political instability. He eventually agrees to leave in late August, and Yoshihiko Noda becomes Japan's 6th Prime Minister in 5 years. Meanwhile, the Arab world experiences its own political tsunami in 2011.
It's the Arab Spring, or Jasmine Revolution, and it all began with the suicide of one person.
More on that when we come back.